Good morning, I'm Melissa Harris Perry. It was a beautiful day Thursday in Dallas, Texas. All 5 living U.S. presidents and first ladies were in their ceremonial finest, all assembled for the pomp and circumstance of inaugurating a presidential library. The grand brick and limestone George W. Bush Presidential Library and Museum on the campus of Southern Methodist University was dedicated this week, along with the Media Blitz rollout that should be aptly referred to as Resurrecting the Bush Legacy Project, which is exactly what a presidential library really is about. I mean, it's the legacy of whatever the president is. But the man himself spoke briefly but directly to that legacy at the dedication ceremony.
But when future generations come to this library and study this administration, they're going to find out that we stayed true to our convictions. And that when our freedom came under attack, we made the tough decisions required to keep the American people safe.
Tough decisions for sure. Ones, in fact, that you, as a visitor, are invited to judge at the nation's 43rd President's Library. If you're in Dallas sometime soon, say on a sequester long layover, you too can adjudicate former President Bush's decisions. Because the library presents you with an interactive video which lays out stark choices that came across the desk of President Bush when he occupied the Oval Office. Questions like how to behave after the nation's most significant terrorist attack. The decisions that had to be made that day on September 11th and the days and months that followed were unquestionably difficult. And the answers set a new standard for how to respond to terrorism. Because however you feel about the 8 years that President Bush led this nation, his administration wrote the book on how Americans respond to a terrorist attack. The response playbook goes like this. First, you thank the first responders, the police, firefighters, EMTs, nurses, doctors, and even the bystanders that charge up the stairs into the flames of the burning building with little concern for their own safety in order to help the wounded. This much-deserved national recognition is truly an important part of our collective healing process. Because it is that hope that comes from knowing there will always be someone who runs toward the fire, not away from it, no matter what, that allows us to get back to business as usual. But then the next thing we do is we assign blame. The enemy, you see, must be identified and his discernible intentions must be named. Since 9/11, when non-state actors took the place of nation states upon whom we could declare war, the enemy has now become a set of ideas and identities. Third, then we must affirm our strength in the face of terror and declare that we will respond with the entire capacity of the American state. Those responsible will hear from all of us soon enough, we say. Oh yeah, by the way, that bullhorn is on display in Dallas. And even as Americans are preparing for retaliation against this new named enemy, so too are we expected to be ready to part with some of our rights in the name of the nebulous and ever-flexible priority of national security. So, if you were following the manual in the days since the Boston Marathon bombing, you would have seen that almost all of these parameters have been met. The first responders were thanked and cheered. The enemy was quickly tied to a well-understood narrative about radicalized Muslim youth, and the full weight of justice has been promised to befall the remaining terrorist suspect. That continuity then and now is undeniable, but not inevitable. Because let's not forget that September 11th was not the first time that there were acts of domestic terrorism that this nation had to recover from. There was the gruesome, inhumane, and consistent acts by the Ku Klux Klan that systematically terrorized an entire people for decades in the U.S. South. The act of racially motivated terrorism, which devastated the congregants and neighbors of the 16th Street Baptist Church on September 15th, 1963, killing 4 precious little girls. Or the Oklahoma City bombing that left 168 people dead and hundreds more injured, and on and on and on throughout our history. Each of these events actually had different responses, different outcomes, but certainly 9/11 was the moment that America at large, as a collective, recognized that we had been thrust onto a broader terrorist stage, an age that demands new responses. And it was President George W. Bush who cast what was possible in black and white with the mentality of either you're with us or you're against us. That's not to say there shouldn't have, or that there should have been leniency for, or that there should have been no sort of response to what happened in Boston. But 12 years after 9/11, should we know by now that the way we respond to terror may in fact require multiple shades of gray? At my table this morning is Bob Herbert, Senior Fellow at the left-leaning public policy organization, Demos. Irshad Manji, who is Executive Producer of Moral Courage Television. James Carafano, who is National Security Expert of the Heritage Foundation. And Dave Zirin, who is Sports Editor for the left-leaning magazine, The Nation magazine. So good to have you all here. James, I want to start with you because I want to start with this idea that the George W. Bush administration gives us our first way of thinking about how we're going to respond. Yeah. What do you think that legacy is?
Well, first of all, I'll say I'm thrilled to be sitting over here on the far left of the table.
Right, on my left-hand side.
So, you brought up a really good point, because I actually wrote a textbook on Homeland Security, and one of the things I went back and looked at the history, and the truth is that every generation of Americans going back to the colonial era worried about being murdered in their beds. And every generation of Americans had to kind of figure that out for their own. And actually, some of the most egregious are real lessons learned. World War I, what Woodrow Wilson did during World War I shredded the Constitution, and it makes actually anything we did post 9/11 look pretty modest. So I will say, in comparison to what we did in World War I, World War II, and even in some respects in the Korean War, what we did post 9/11 was not anywhere near the record of abusing the Constitution. And I think
it's useful to remember that, right? Yeah. That in World War II we had internment camps for Japanese citizens because we understood their identity as essentially making them basically enemy combatants, even though we didn't have that word. But at the same time that we can say, okay, so it wasn't that. It wasn't internment camps. I think we also have to be careful to recognize just how problematic some of those policies were. Dave?
Yeah, I think not as bad as the Palmer raids isn't the best tagline for the Bush administration.
That could be one of the exhibits in Dallas.
I mean, look, I'm a sports writer by trade. That means one of the things I've done in the last 10 years is get to know the family of Pat Tillman, the story of Pat Tillman, the NFL player turned Army Ranger who died in an instance of friendly fire in Afghanistan. Pat Tillman was someone who thought the war in Iraq was illegal, and I agree with Pat Tillman about that. And his family was lied to by the Bush administration about the circumstances surrounding his death. And George W. Bush gave speeches about Pat Tillman and his heroism that were lies. So every time I hear about George W. Bush and staying the course and his principles, I keep wondering why he's not on trial for war crimes, for lying to the family of Pat Tillman, for lying to the families of the people who are crippled at Walter Reed, for the families that have died in the Middle East. And I wonder very strongly why the Obama administration has chosen continuity instead of a break with the policies of the Bush administration.
Well, you know, interesting, that point, which I think is one that is a critique often leveled against President Obama, especially on the left, is this idea that whatever happened in the George W. Bush administration became the new normative. It became the normal way to respond, so that we now see many of the scripts that were written in the context of 9/11 emerging again, for example, post-Boston.
Well, we make all of this stuff becomes all right because it's been put in the context of a war. I mean, we declared war against terror, which is a war against a tactic, which is silly. And you know, so now that we've militarized everything, every time we have an act of terror, including the one up in Boston, we see it as, I don't know, an attack against the state or something, as opposed to an attack against individuals, and we see it as an act of war instead of as a crime. And when you make something an act of war, you lose all perspective if it's not really an act of war.
James, is that right? War versus crime here?
Well, I want to say two things, both in defense of President Bush and defense of President Obama, is post 9/11, we forget, is we didn't know what was coming next. And in many sense, they were ad hocing it all the way. And I wouldn't disagree that, say, this is just continuity. And I'll give you a good example where I'm actually extremely proud of Secretary Napolitano, and you flashed it on the screen, the color-coded alert system. It was, good risk is, understandable, actionable, and credible. It was none of those. It was a nutty idea. You walk through the airport, you heard the color code is orange. Anybody stop and say, oh my God, what do I do? It was nuts.
Right.
And when the secretary came in office, this is one of the things we talked about. We said, this is really nuts. And to her credit, she got rid of it, even knowing that some people might criticize her in the department for saying, oh, we're not serious about the war on terror anymore because you got rid of this. But it was a dumb idea that was done as a knee-jerk reaction to 9/11, which we stopped doing. I'm proud of things like that.
So, Irshad, so what about this notion that part of what happens here isn't evil? And I think that's useful. Like, sometimes I think the left, it's easy to look at George W. Bush and be like, he's a bad guy, he's stupid, he's evil, he's all these things. You create a caricature and instead say, we just didn't know. He was, as we would say in political science, he was muddling through because it was
I think he himself said.
Right, because it was an unknown moment.
And Obama said during his speech at the opening of the GWB library. Yes, we often don't know. And wouldn't it be a refreshing change for any politician to stand up and say, I don't know the answer to that, and we are doing the very best we can, and stay tuned and give us your feedback, but we are, we're trying. But wait a minute, Rob, I want to get back to you for just a minute, because I think you made a very, very interesting point about how post 9/11, the notion of individuals have taken a backseat to the notion of the state and groups being identified. But I would say, and you sort of alluded to this in your question to me, Melissa, that even progressives have fed into that cycle. So, for example, we can never forget, of course, the ugly debate around the so-called Ground Zero Mosque. What I noticed, however,
wasn't much of a debate.
Well, but actually, what I noticed was that during that time, people would be for or against the project based only on how offended they felt by people who disagreed with them. So it had very little to do with the merits of the project, but rather who I hate and who ticks me off the most. I would suggest that now we have enough distance from 9/11 that we can actually use our freedoms to do something more constructive than hate, and that is ask questions. So,
so let's take a break and come back. No, we're going to come back, because it's exactly where I want to pick up is, are we asking the right kinds of questions in a moment like this? I'm back.